Hello and welcome to this special report from Zanut TV. I'm Nick Peters. Now, Make UK has released its first executive survey of 2021, looking back at the upheavals of last year and finding out what lessons manufacturers can and perhaps should learn from it all. I'm delighted to welcome Stephen Thibson, Chief Executive of Make UK. Happy New Year, Stephen.
Happy New Year, Nick. Good to be with you.
And Cara Haffey, who's manufacturing lead partner at PwC, which sponsored the report. Welcome, Cara.
Happy New Year, Nick. Welcome.
Thank you. Now, Stephen, the report's title is Building Agility in Manufacturing. Clearly, 2020 taught us that the manufacturers who are likely to thrive are indeed those who have the agility to adapt in a crisis. I think it's a fair judgment to make, yes?
Absolutely right. And we saw some really good examples of that from those companies that participated in things like the ventilator challenge and the PPE challenges, where they're able to convert their capacity to respond to the national crisis. That was a good sign of agility. I think longer term, Nick, we're starting to see now company boards in manufacturers really thinking about supply chain resilience going forwards as well. And that has many facets to it, some of which will be a benefit to the UK as we consider reshoring, for example, things that were on extended supply chains. So really this whole area of agility is very important. It brings it into sharp focus. And of course, as we know, during the lockdown periods, manufacturers were able to continue to operate. So they were learning how to deal with constraints on demand and on supply at the same time. And so it's really made them rethink in a lot of ways the way those supply chains are constructed. And I think that's going to put us in a very good position going forwards.
I'd like to talk about supply chains, reshoring, etc., in a little bit more detail later on. But Cara, what does the report say to you about the lessons manufacturers have taken from the disruptions of last year?
I think it definitely says to me that our manufacturers have learnt a lot. So, it's been difficult times, but I think when you speak to manufacturers, they have learnt a lot of things. They've had to put a lot of focus in managing their people and also have learnt about the supply chain, as Stephen said. And actually, I think a lot of them have learnt things that they will keep in place now, which is interesting. And they've also had to really upskill in their digital context, not always for people on the shop floor, but they've also learnt about how to be a more agile workforce and who's in, who's not, how do they keep communicating. So I'm sure those are all skills that they will continue to do so in 2021 and beyond.
Yeah, I mean, just look at the way we're doing this now. Normally, I'd expect to be, somewhere else in the country sitting with you in a room. And instead, we're doing this interview over Zoom. Stephen, do you think that this digital awareness that Cara's just been talking about is going to translate into speedier adoption of industrial digital technologies, which, of course, is a campaign that's been going on for years now and is still vital necessity for UK manufacturing?
Absolutely right, Nick. This is something that we've been working on very hard, particularly with the Made Smarter Commission now for the last couple of years. And the challenge was before the pandemic. The challenge was, of course, getting that adoption amongst the smaller companies in the manufacturing community. And we saw some great results from the pilot we had up in the Northwest. But I think during the pandemic, of course, we are using things like video conferencing, but what we also saw is that manufacturers were able to rapidly deploy things like digital collaboration. Again, going back to things like the ventilator challenge, a lot of that, because it couldn't be done physically, was done over collaborative tools. It got people in the supply chains used to using and seeing firsthand the benefits of using digital collaboration. And those lessons stick. People are much more interested, much more aware, and much more cognizant of the benefits that digital manufacturing techniques can actually deploy to their business. And I think that's really going to give us a boost. I think that, coupled with the additional support we've seen from government recently, where they've allocated more funding towards Made Smarter, is going to really help us this year start to accelerate that technology adoption in the digital area for manufacturing. So that will be a benefit from the experiences that we've had during a very difficult 2020, I think, Nick.
Yeah, it's been a terrible year, and of course it hasn't really ended in terms of the trouble. It's still with us. Digital is obviously a silver lining, but Kara, we've left the single market and the customs union. We have a trade deal with the EU, but it's not at all frictionless. What does the report say about manufacturers and the degree to which they're perturbed about that in the coming year?
Yeah, no, I think it was what we expected, Nick, in that a lot of our manufacturers are still concerned about the customs delays and increased cost of regulation. So, as you say, what we have is something, and obviously most of our manufacturing community wanted a deal of some sort, but it's still not frictionless. People are having to get themselves up to speed in terms of the paperwork that's needed filled in, how everything kind of makes sure that the cross-border situation is as seamless as possible. And then a third of companies also believe that the investment prospects for the UK will decrease from being outside the EU. So, I have to say one of the areas where the report was quite downbeat was in this kind of new relationship with the EU. But we know that our manufacturers are very versatile and they do get used to things quickly and they find routes. So, we're hoping that as we move through this year, that becomes something that people are used to and that we can find benefit from it.
Yes, Stephen, the fragility of supply chains at the very start of the pandemic, the long attenuated supply chains to places like China, was one of the most striking impacts of the pandemic. What does it mean for the shape of UK manufacturing in the years ahead, particularly now that we're out of the EU totally, out of the single market and customs union, that rules of origin are going to play a much greater part in the way manufacturers assemble products in the UK?
Yes, and I think this sort of affects different sectors of the manufacturing community in different ways, basically, Nick. We've got a large contingent of just-in-time manufacturing, which relies on short-term, highly sophisticated logistics, that free trade across the border going backwards and forwards to Europe. In that sense, rules of origin is not too bad, although there is a lot of bureaucracy around proving the rules of origin, of course, and making sure your paperwork's up to speed. And we have got a year to be able to get that in place, but making sure that those logistics stay in place and that customs interface is seamless is really important. And of course, that is worrying people. So we need to work through that issue there on the just-in-time part. And I think a lot of manufacturers really learned a lesson on extended supply chains. We've been through probably the last decade or so around optimizing costs, being used to incredibly sophisticated logistics chains, enabling companies to source components on the other side of the world, rely very accurately on their delivery slots back into the UK. And what happened during the pandemic is that we learned that in some cases, risk was not being really adequately thought about in those supply chains. And so there is quite a lot of discussion now about building resilience into those supply chains. How do we build resilience? How do we make sure those supply chains are short? This is probably not, unfortunately, going to be the last episode of something like a pandemic. So how do we avoid the risks to the supply chains in the future? Some of that will involve people looking at local supply, so the opportunity to reshore some of that. Some of that will be looking towards bringing things closer to home, perhaps not sourcing some of those components in China if we can avoid it, but actually doing it more locally, which would actually go towards making sure we're doing more things with our European partners and other closer to home aspects of it. But I think it does provide an opportunity, a really good opportunity to see what else we can do in the UK and whether we can bring some of that onshore rather than reliant on extended supply chains. So I think what we'll see in those procurement decisions is that risk and resilience will be brought into it, as well as cost and quality, which has been the traditional way of thinking about supply.
Yeah, that's obviously quite an optimistic prospect you're describing. But Kara, I wonder if some of the infrastructure, the financial infrastructure, the regulatory infrastructure around manufacturing is conducive to us sort of broadening our manufacturing base in this country, particularly finance. I'm wondering if lack of capital might be a problem for manufacturers trying to broaden their activities in the UK.
I think financing always comes up, and it will be different by subsector. We do have headwinds in some of our subsectors of manufacturing, which obviously finance and investors do look at and try to judge the future. I would say, however, in a positive frame of mind, that the manufacturing sector has shown its resilience over last year. Some of the few businesses that were still working and were still producing throughout the whole year were our manufacturers. So I think the finance behind that and wanting to invest in good, stable businesses will be there. I do think financing will be thoughtful depending on the sector outlook, and that's very difficult at the moment for some of our sectors. But hopefully that comes back, and as we kind of try to build more exports as well as kind of reshoring, then I'm hoping that people will be able to build business plans that are financeable and backable.
Stephen, a lot of what Cara has just described obviously is going to involve the political input from things like industrial strategy, and we haven't heard a great deal about industrial strategy from the government in recent months. Hardly surprising, I suppose, given the focus on Brexit and the pandemic. What are you hearing, and what kind of vision do you think the government can and should have in terms of industrial strategy?
Right. So yes, Nick, good point. I think in terms of industrial strategy, absolutely vitally important. What's interesting at the moment is a lot of companies have a lot of money on their balance sheets, which they've accumulated through the pandemic. A lot of the investment hold up that we see is more about confidence in the future and the plan. And so it's vitally important we have an industrial strategy now, so that there is an investment vision for many companies to know what they're going to do. Very often the investment window is 10 years in manufacturing, and making sure they've got that long-term stability and the government is able to create a framework which enables that to happen is absolutely vital. Plus, of course, we've got the other issues around industrial strategy, which kind of the threads that need pulling together. It's about sectors, it's about place, it's about skills, and it's about having a comprehensive plan from government that really enables that investment confidence to drive this going forward. So a really important point, something I constantly raise with ministers, is that we need to move quickly to a new industrial strategy. Outside of the EU, what does that look like? How do we encourage the sector to invest? And I think that's vitally important going forward.
Do you have any confidence they're going to do that, Stephen, though?
I think so. We've had some initial discussions with Alok Sharma, for example, who's very confident that we'll be consulting on a revision to the industrial strategy in the very near future. And we're getting ourselves ready for that. So we are preparing exactly what we'd like to see in a comprehensive plan going forwards. And it needs to be something that survives political cycles, Nick, something that's longer term. I mentioned the 10-year investment horizon for many manufacturers when they're buying equipment or investing in new production lines. And so it needs to go past the normal political cycles that we've got in this country. It's something that's not just rearranging the deck chairs, but something that's really a proper plan for the future.
Well, it's going to be a very, very interesting year. It's got off to a fairly difficult start, given that we're still in lockdown. But I think that the report demonstrates that there's a lot to look forward to and a lot to be optimistic about in 2021. Stephen Thibson from Make UK and Cara Haffey from PwC, thank you both very much indeed for being with us. This has been a special report from Sanute TV. I'm Nick Peters. Thank you very much indeed for watching. I'll see you again soon.